Thank you for being at my talk and welcome. Well, yes, that slide is Spice Girls. I also saw some Backstreet Boys on the program today. It's intentional, but we're going to talk about autonomy today. And I might seem a bit more nervous than I usually am today. First of all, my wife's in the audience. She's writing things down, and most of the social part of this talk comes from her. So if you might see me nervous, oh no, what did I say now? She will give me the feedback at the end. Second thing is, and you might notice Evelyn's not here. Unfortunately, she's ill at home. She made this slide especially for you. I saw this morning. So I will take up her part of the story as well. So it might be sometimes that I need to quickly check what's on the notes, but hopefully the story will flow today. So usually in our talks, we usually start about something other than IT. And this is, well, roughly where I work or live. And 2 years ago, we moved houses, me and my wife, to this place. And you thought buying a house, which is different, by the way, than in Germany, I learned, because here you usually do renting. In the Netherlands, you try to always buy a house, which we did. And you thought, well, I own the land, I own the house, I can do whatever I want, right? I'm autonomous. Well, poorly, if you can see here, there's a driveway. Oh, there it is. There's a driveway here and a car. In our legal agreement, it says you need to put a car on that piece of land because in the area, there's not a lot of parking spaces. So you need to be able to put your car there, right? So autonomy? Don't think so. I don't have full autonomy on that piece of land. Secondly, me and my wife love cats. We have 2 cats and they need a door, right? So yeah, if you have a cat, there's even lower autonomy there, even though we own it. Right? And that's a bit similar to what we're going to talk about today, is what we see in the IT. And a lot of it is driven by this book, Drive. Who has read Mr. Pink? Yeah, autonomy. And as you can see here, right, autonomy as described by Mr. Pink is directing one's own life. That's what we're going to talk about today. And we're not going to talk about the philosophy behind autonomy, because, well, you have Eric Berne. Are we really autonomous? Can we really be autonomous? Because when we grow up, well, this can take years to philosophize about this. So it's not about this, but it's about the word autonomy. And autonomy, when you look at the word and the definition, I come from domain-driven design. We like our definitions of language. You see, it's self-directing freedom, a self-governing state. It has its principles in law. And for me, that's a bit weird, and I totally go up with Jay Bloom and Mark here. I hate the word autonomy. That doesn't mean I don't believe in autonomy, but it's really individuating, right? It's I direct my own life. If I'm working in a team, I don't have full autonomy, right? I need to work with other people, so I cannot decide what to do. I work with other teams. I work in an organization. So can we truly be autonomous there? That's what we talk will be about. And what we see is that autonomy can be really compulsive. Yeah. What we see is that autonomy, we wanted it because who of you works in a hierarchical company and get dictated how to do their design? So usually the first thing we do is go the other way. Well, I want to be autonomous. That's what I wanted. But then you go the other way of what we call a polarity. And I'll introduce that polarity. For me, autonomy is the individual. It's the part of a polarity called the whole and the part. And both have downsides and both have upsides. And that's what we want to manage on different levels of the organization. So it's not like I can do whatever I want today. For me, that's not autonomy. I don't think that's what we want. But I want to do it how I want it to do, right? And autonomy is ambiguous. As you can see, I gave you my definition of autonomy. You might not agree with me, which is perfectly fine. And that's what this talk is about. We need to see how much autonomy do we want and how can we design how much autonomy we can have and how much is okay for us. Because I do believe in self-steering teams. I do believe in people steering their own way. And I don't believe in the bureaucratic hierarchy here. And that's what this talk is about. And that's what is in the stories today. We have several stories that it's about the context you're in, how much autonomy you will want. Yeah, and that requires a vision. It requires not how, but why. And I already talked about this. We'll be using this polarity map. Who's ever seen a polarity map before? A polarity map is really about that polarity I was talking about. You have the part on the left and the whole on the right. It's the same with breathing in and breathing out. It's also sort of like a polarity, right? You need both. And for me, autonomy sits on the right, on the left side. It's part. The autonomy is about uniqueness. We need that, right? We want the uniqueness. But we also want the connectedness. We also want to belong and build stuff together for a purpose. And you see they have both sides. And on the downside, you see what you don't want. Because alignment creates sameness, right? The whole creates, now we're all the same. It might lead to groupthink even. That's what we don't want. And in the lower part, it's about isolation. Uniqueness can, or autonomy can lead to isolation. Working in isolation, and that's also what we don't want. So we want to balance these things out. And that's what this talk is about. And before we go there, in the middle you see the lemniscat, right? It's like a continuous thing. And my friend Hien, or actually Evelyn and my friend Hien, has this nice fun fact intermezzo we always do in our workshops as well. And here's a question to you. That lemniscat, what does it mean? Does it mean round corners, decorated with hanging ribbons, or the devil's curve? Who thinks A? Who thinks B? Who thinks C? It was B. It's actually decorated with hanging ribbons. Really interesting fun fact. So you can look it up afterwards. So, but let's dive in. We're going to dive into 4 aspects of an organization. The first one is about code, right? We have the polarity working for us in code. Can we be autonomous in code? Do we want to be autonomous, and how much autonomy? Then we go to teams. Then we go between teams. And then we go in organization. Yeah? So let's start with code. I've a background in software engineering. I'm a Java developer. Sorry if that's not good for you, sorry. I also did JavaScript and C#. But let's start with Java. When I first started coding, I saw this in my code. And what's this? It's I have a class and I write 1 unit test for it. Yeah, which is fine. But this is how I started programming. And what we call that is we try to isolate that unit. But is a class a unit, etc., etc.? That I didn't go into it. So when I first started coding, I was like 1 class, 1 unit test. Make sense? Who does that? 1 class, 1 unit test? Sort of like, yeah, nice. I like that. And there was this nice blog post by Martin Fowler. And he says actually, you have 2 types of tests, the sociable test and you have the solitary test. See where the polarity is happening again? There's the social, is the whole, and there's the part, which is the solitary test. And you need them both. It depends on the situation when you use one over the other. They both have their downsides. But what I usually see in organizations, and what I did in the past as well, I'd pick one strategy. I said, okay, let's go for the solitary tests, because that's how I do it. And that's the autonomy part, right? I can do my piece of work, but what you will lack is the connectiveness, right? How does it all hang together? Where's the coherence? And a unit test isn't necessarily a class. A unit is a unit of work, so it might be a bunch of tests. And there comes my friend Thomas in that says, well, we don't want the pyramid. We want to have this diamond where acceptance tests, which can be unit tests, is what we eventually want. We want our whole bunch of code to work for the behavior we want. We might write deeper, fine-grained unit tests, which are the solitary tests. And we also want to do some upper-level contract integration tests, etc., etc. But the focus is in the middle. But yeah, what's the middle? I already mentioned I come from domain-driven design. We use the bounded context pattern. For us, that's a unit of work, or actually a model for a specific purpose, which has linguistic boundaries. Our first boundary. And it is a unit of consistent language with that model. So from there, we can use that diamond. For me, that's the boundary wherein I will decide when will I do the coarse grain and when do I do the fine-grained unit test, right? And to give you a bit more feeling about what a bounded context is, it's not the code. The code represents the bounded context. Yeah, so that's a small introduction. And how would that look? This is a hexagonal thing. And if you would look in the middle, you see a few objects in our domain. And you see, well, I have 3 objects, which are kind of okay. And maybe it's an aggregate pattern, maybe not, but I can test these as a whole, these 3 things. And then I say, well, you know, this object here in the middle, that's really complex. And I use a more fine-grained unit test. And thus, I use them both depending on the situation. Because if we now look back at our polarity map, you can see the solitary tests, they test in isolation and they have fast feedback on failure. Well, that's nice to have. The sociable tests have coherent testing and no mocking or coupling inside your domain. You mock the outside, but not the inside. But both also has downsides and negative effect, right? The solitary test can have cascading changes on mock stops and loss of unit of work of the cohesiveness. And on the right side, we have the sociable test, right? There are failure of bug in other classes and slower feedback on failure. If I'm testing multiple objects at the same time, my feedback loop might be harder, longer. And that's what we don't want. So use them whenever you think you might need one or the other. Don't put yourself into one of these polarities. Use them both in your thing. And also, you can delete them if needed, right? The end goal is, does my code actually do what it's supposed to do? Which are the acceptance coarse-grained ones. And the fine-grained ones are actually there for this faster feedback loop. If it gets more complex, the deeper the code you go. Yeah, so here's an example of the first stage of our polarity. Autonomy on the left side, alignment on the right side. We want to be on the top side. And how are we going to do that? Let's see in the next example. So let's talk a bit about autonomy in teams. And then I'll show you how can we move between these 2 polarities and keep that balance, right? So first thing, if we look at autonomy in teams, one thing to say here is people really like to have a sense of belonging. Yeah, so if you have in a team, you have people that want to have autonomy, that's nice, but you want to have a feeling of belonging. If you don't have a feeling of belonging, autonomy will lead to isolation. Yeah? That's the paradox. We want to be autonomous, but at the same time, we also want to belong to something. And that doesn't mean that you need to do that the how you do the work is different, right? Some people would like to work from the office together, and some people would like to work from home in isolation. And that can be perfectly fine, and you can perfectly have in a team a sense of belonging together, right? It's not about how you do the work, it's about that sense of belonging. But usually what happens when it gets messy and we don't discuss these rules, right? How do we want to do the work together? How we want to optimize this to work together. This is a conversation you need to have in your team. But what usually happens is at some point, maybe someone takes the lead. Sometimes it's nice that some other person takes the decision and you just can code. But if you keep in that status quo and that person keeps making the decision, then we can turn into a dictatorship. Right? If we don't keep renegotiating what autonomy means for our team, it means that that person taking the decision, which at the first part is perfectly fine, that they might be the senior, they might have the most knowledge of the domain, it can turn into a dictatorship. Right? We need to keep renegotiating these boundaries of autonomy. The scale on how much autonomy is there in the team, and we need to keep continuously go there. Because of course, it's a guilty pleasure. I have the guilty pleasure of, I sometimes just want to code, let other person wants to take the decision. Who has that? Like, it's fine that some other person takes a decision. I went on a bachelor last weekend and it was perfectly fine. Other people took the decision and I'll just tag along. It was a nice party. I enjoyed it. But you need to keep renegotiating it. That's the key, and that's what we usually don't do. And what it then happens is that we can say, we can hold it against someone. Right? They say, yeah, but you wanted me to take the decision, right? So autonomy is not an excuse to also hold it against another person here, right? So we want to protect ourselves, and the autonomy sounded good at the start, but at some point some things change, and it might change a lot. So let me give you an example from my working with teams in code. We had a nice bounded we didn't have a bounded context here, right? Because the bounded context will give you purpose and that connectness. We didn't have this. And a friend of mine went to a conference to low code, and this is what the person saw, right? The problem as an application team grows, delivery slows down because multiple developers compete for the change of code. Who's been in this situation? Yeah, and it always leads to, okay, let's introduce feature branching. Okay, I don't really get why we would optimize or solve a problem that says, well, maybe we need to discuss the boundaries and the autonomy to let's use tools to fix our problem, right? Because if you look at feature branching, and I'm not against branching, but if you look at it, there's always late feedback, and you will lose connectiveness again, right? This feature branching is focused on autonomy, isolation, and the compulsiveness that I just want to do my work alone. That's fine. We should be able to do our work alone, but at some point, if you're competing to change the same goal, maybe we need to start talking to each other and see how we can fix this together. Go pairing. I don't agree with a lot of people saying, pairing, well, I agree with pairing is amazing, or ensemble programming is amazing, but not all the time. You need to see when will I use it and when can we just go back programming alone. It's the balance again, right? Because what this does is at some points, and the keynote already talked about, right? At some points it leads to 12,000 lines of code changed in your review. And then sunk cost fallacy comes in. Who's heard about sunk cost fallacy? Right? Yeah, we spend so many times writing the code, let's not change it. Right? Let's just ship it now because it took 2 weeks. I'm against that. Right? I want to have faster feedback, and that it doesn't mean you can still work in isolation. It can, and that means you want to design it together. So that's the second part of this polarity map, right? You have the, well, branching gives freedom, gives individual creativity. Perfect. You sometimes still want that, maybe. But the trunk-based part is care for the whole, shared mental model, team effort. That's also what we want. Both sides we want. What we don't want is excessive conformity, because that's what ensemble programming does. That's what pairing at some points does. It creates that excessive conformity. You don't want that, and you don't want loss of cohesion mental models in the branching part, right? Because people start competing against each other anyway, and you have these huge merge conflicts. That's also what we don't want. So we have these signals and observations on the left side. So when this happens, we need to take action, right? Compete to change the same code. What are we going to do? Let's ensemble, mob, or pair programming. So from both sides of the polarity, you need to make signals, observations together, design them together, saying, okay, when do we actually see our moving towards the negative effect of branching? Okay, that's this one. Okay, let's all agree that once that happens, let's take action. The signals observation needs to be observable, meaning it needs to be measured, preferably. Yeah? So that's how you can balance this autonomy versus alignment polarity in a team level. You need to design it together. And meaning, if you do this at the first time, it will take some time to change, right? But at some point, it will be part of your team saying, oh, we're competing again, let's do this. But in the first time, you really need to reinforce that together. And that's why you make decisions, you consent to that decision as a team. So that's autonomy within teams. Now let's talk about autonomy between teams, and especially the ivory tower. Who's ever worked with an ivory tower architect? Who's ever been an ivory tower architect? Yeah, it happens sometimes because we're not having that feedback loop in place. But I already talked a bit about domain-driven design, and there's more talks, and I've already heard it today. There will also be talks about team topology. And there's a match made in heaven here, because domain-driven design talks about purpose, right? The models, the bounded context is we're solving a problem for a specific purpose. Yeah? And team topology is about the interaction between these teams and how do we set these teams up. So just a very quick introduction. I think this morning was already a quick introduction, but you have 4 types of teams. You have the complicated subsystem team, which is if you need to have some specific technology. A friend of mine worked with FPGAs, working with getting in data from cameras. That's a complicated subsystem team. There were only a few people who could do that, right? So their purpose mostly was using that FPGA. Right? Then we have the platform team. Most people probably know that's this one already. And then you have the stream-aligned team. And the bounded context from domain-driven design matches with these stream-aligned teams. There can be multiple bounded contexts in one stream-aligned team, by the way. But what you want to optimize for is what they say in the book, right? We should be thinking about limiting the size of software, service, and product to the cognitive load that the team can handle. But again, here I see a sense of we want to have autonomous teams on a stream-aligned team, right? But in team topology, they also talk about the interactions between the stream-aligned teams or with the platform team. And I'm getting to that enabling team a bit later on. And domain-driven design already has strategies that matches with this, because there's this partnership pattern that truly match with the high collaboration interaction with team topology. So to give you a good idea, right, we want to have autonomous teams, and that means at some point we might have a customer journey team that's building the customer journey in, and they're using some backend APIs. But once you start building that, then people talk, oh, let's set up an API already from the start, right? Let's build up an API and then let's work autonomous. Well, that feels to me like big design up front. And we don't want that. So what we're going to do, we're going to put these teams into a collaboration, or what DDD calls a partnership, which lowers the amount of autonomy, which is fine at that point, but you don't want to stay in this. So you need to renegotiate with the teams. How do you want to work together? Maybe first the teams say, okay, let's become one big team of 10 people, slowly collaborating with each other, having the same rhythm, lowering the autonomy, which is fine. And then at some point you go to an as a service, right? Because now you let the API evolve. And that's fine. That's fine to design it like that. I usually start like this as well. Yeah? And then you have the 4th team, which is the enabling team. What do we do with the architects is usually the question I get, right? We have this architect team. And I'm not really against the architect teams as long as they don't impose design on the teams. Right? The teams need to be self-steering in that way, but they might have a goal. But one thing, sometimes when you want to design something new, it might be great to have an architect enabling team. But there's one thing an architect enabling team has, and that's avoid becoming that ivory tower of knowledge, so dictating technical choices for other teams to follow. So what do we want is, what team topology said, is this team has an end date. Sort of like a solution architecture, right? How would you embed this towards a team, and how would you collaborate and enable the teams instead of imposing the teams? This is what I usually see. It's usually switched. We have an architect team who's imposing rather than, okay, what do they need and how can I help the teams with their purpose? And what would be the end date of our team? When do we actually dissolve? Because else you're going to get this nice comic agile thing that in the end, look, we're really effective as an architect team, but nobody actually uses our products or our outcomes, right? Nice that we have a total framework and we have all these patterns, but the teams aren't actually using our patterns. Awesome. No. And so one thing to notice here, in that polarity, if you stick with one polarity for a long time, in this case, you stay an enabling team and you work a lot in isolation, then at some point you also get the downside of the other polarity for some bizarre reason, right? So at some point you get loss of equality, isolation, selfish. Who've seen teams doing that, right? And architect teams in isolation. I've been in this team, by the way. And at some point you also get excessive conformity, sameness, high cognitive load, because now they're imposing on the other teams what to do, and they need to confirm. So you get downside of the both things, but actually you want to do collaboration and isolation at the same time. Yeah? So just so you know, that's why we have enabling teams that have an end date. And that's why I really have a beef with this framework. Because this is conformity and this is not about collaboration. There's use in this, probably, I have not seen it yet, but for me it's too much structure and it's too much isolation and it's too much autonomy. So let's switch to the last part, which is about autonomy in organization. What do we do with all the leaders, the managers, the architects? I already talked about that, right? And a nice famous quote by Eckhoff is, right, managers are not confronted with problems that are independent to solve. They're confronted with messes that they need to manage. And that's what we also try to do in the organization. It's a continuous negotiation and help supporting the teams. You don't want to have a hierarchy there. So it's about setting visions. Where is the organization going to so that the teams can align themselves, right? So bring the vision, design the boundaries with the teams, to the teams, and define their behavior together. Yeah, so that's about vision and boundaries and both. And so who calls the shots now? This is also a dynamic that constantly changes. Right? Sometimes you want to have centralized decision-making. Most of the time you want to have decentralized decision-making. This is again with alignment and autonomy. It's the same polarity here. And it can be confusing because sometimes a manager might say, okay, we gave them autonomy, right? But why aren't they doing anything with it? They wanted autonomy. We've seen this before. So giving autonomy is also, again, imposing a design on the team. And you don't want that. You want to have a discussion with the team. What do they need? I had teams that are meteor, and this person needed to decide which front-end framework will we going to use in the next couple of years while we recruit 100 people on it. Can you imagine how scared that person was? They didn't want to make that decision for the whole company. So, but giving that person first the opportunity to do so, and then have the conversation, the tough conversation about the fear, that's what you want to do as a manager. Manage the mess. Manage that, we call it the boundary, right? And that's what, for me, should a architect outside of the teams or a manager outside of the teams do. Make sure that the team can do whatever they want in that. Yeah? And manage especially that polarity between decentralized decision-making, which is empowering the individual spontaneous and individual acting decisively, and avoid that they cannot coordinate or get FOMO or burden of consequences for mistakes. And sometimes that means, okay, now we're going to make centralized decisions, empowering to the group can coordinate, everyone feels included, and be sure that at some point we're not going into queues, because that's what usually happens, right? If you have an architecture team makes a decision, queues start to build up. The teams cannot move forward, you don't want that, right? And no creativity, disempowerment, and that's the balance managers and, in my opinion, architects outside the team, if you want to have that, right? It's also a decision, should do. All that the team can make their decisions themselves. And one thing to know, we've been from the lowest polarity in code to the organization, and all these things are fractal, what we call. If on an organization level you highly value bureaucratic and alignment, you can be damn sure that you cannot get teams to become autonomous, because it's a fractal pattern that drives to the lower part. As an example, I've worked with an organization that highly valued action. So the highest, the owner could come to the desk of a developer, say, I want to change this to that. That's action, like, do it. So throughout the whole organization, every time you try to plan or align with them, they say, oh, this takes too long, let's just do things. There's the polarity happening again. And then I'm trying on the team level to build in planning, but at some point that owner will come in and will say, no, you need to do this. Right? So be sure these things are fractal from top to end. So autonomy, is that what we really want? I think so, if depending on your definition, but we want to define and negotiate these boundaries continuously with the teams, right? What does it mean, autonomy for you? How much autonomy do you want, do you need, and manage that polarity in the teams, with the teams, and that's what's my talk today. Thank you. And I think we have roughly 9 more minutes. These are my cats. The right one is Evelyn's cat, by the way. So we love cats and we give cat tags. And leave the judging to them, right? So are there any
the cats are fantastic. Thank
questions?
you.
So there's the QR code again if you want to do some questions.
Yeah, we've got room for a lot of questions. So by far, the most upvoted question today says, "Happy birthday."
Thank you.
Is it today?
Yeah, it's today.
Can I have a birthday ovation, please?
Thank you.
The next one. How can you convince a Scrum hardliner of team topologies? For instance, an enabling team doesn't immediately create customer value. Same for platform team.
Mm-hmm. Well, depending on your definition of value, you mean value to the business? That would be my first question. They provide value by lowering the load of the stream-aligned team, making sure they can build faster business value. They can collaborate more. And all these different alignments between the value streams, right? They all have same problems. So I would also say the platform team should listen. Well, this is normal one. Should listen to these teams and see what their problems are, and then align them together. And that would be, well, it's less scrummy, but I think Aino said it great today, right? At some point, you might see, this Scrum doesn't work for me. We need to do it differently. I hope that answers the question. If not, let me know.
So do I. We have an empty queue. I hope you can do something about it. Do we have any questions? Otherwise, we have a fantastic agent. Oh, look, there's one. Who is taking the responsibility and what enables them to do so on both ends of the polarity map?
It's first and foremost, I believe in that the team takes that ownership, right? But it's usually someone, sorry to say, agile coachy, who's introducing it to the team if they need it. Right, so I give a lot of collaborative modeling sessions like event storming, and the polarities work there as well. So I first see and observe that the teams are dealing with a polarity. What I do is give them back to the team, but the team then decides if they want to do something with them. It's never me as a facilitator or as an architect outside the team making the decision, oh, you need to do this map now. Now I introduce the map to them if they need it. And that's like really seeing, oh, you're dealing with both sides of the polarity now. Is that how you see it as well? Then the team might say, yeah, okay, I have a nice exercise we can do, which is the polarity map. And by doing so, I introduce them to polarity mapping and help them do it themselves afterwards. That's always my goal. I'm not there to always be necessary to do polarity mapping. I'm introducing it as a sort of, and Alicia Guerrero says this as a catalyst, right? We don't want a specific leader imposing it. It's a catalyst that say, okay, I'm helping you if you need the help with this map and the tools. And then the team should be, we always have the goal of doing it themselves if they need it or if they see it's helpful to them. If it's not helpful to them, it's not on me to decide or impose that they should do it. I just give the feedback. I hope that answers that question. So I'm always optimizing for what does the team need and reflecting back on the team. If they don't feel the pain, I won't impose anything on the team because it won't help them anyway.
Do you have some best practices or tools to do the negotiation within teams or organizations?
Can you repeat the last part? So
take a look.
Do you have some? Well, for me, I use a lot of collaborative modeling, event storming. I'm writing a book now with Evelyn and Gien about collaborative modeling and about the process of collaborative modeling. So you have tools like event storming or user story mapping And there's many more of these tools, how to collaboratively model and design. And that doesn't only go into architectural design, it also goes into team design, right? And there's a whole process surrounding this. So yeah, that's mostly I can say now. In that process, it's bigger than just, okay, let's try event storming. That usually helps a bit, but there's a lot of ranking, bias, and we gave a talk before, me and Evelyn, about that, surrounding that workshop. But I like to use workshop, and I know Trond is here, he gives the, I cannot pronounce this, so this is not good for me, participatory design. We call it collaborative modeling. It's like having the people in the room, you need a facilitator for that, and a lot of tools needed for the situation at the moment. So I hope that helps. There's already a book you can download, Visual Collaboration Tools from LeanPub. It's free, where you can already see how these tools work. And within domain-driven design community, we also have a lot of these tools that can already help you. There's liberating structures, of course, that can help you with that. And there's many more of this content online for free. So hope that answers the question.
How do you deal with apathetic teams who have a significant level of autonomy?
Who has a lot of autonomy, I think. Yeah, so I've seen these teams, I've worked with the teams once where we figured out during the design that the other team needed to change something and reverse something, and then I say, okay, well, let's bring that team in. And they say, no, we can't because they have autonomy on their backlog. Okay, so that means you need to have some sort of communication with the team. If there's no communication, it will be hard. My goal always is to at least get them into a room. So I have a conversation with them, and then we call it guerrilla modeling, right? While we're having the conversation, I pop open a screen or my paper roll. I can do that. Not everyone could do that, by the way. But I could pop open a screen and start modeling it out for them. If that doesn't help, one thing I've did before, and that's a bit harder nowadays, but if you're still working in a physical space, pop open, start modeling at the coffee corner and make mistakes. Something like that to sort of like get them into the conversation and show them we need to do this. But that's the problem if you put too much autonomy in an organization, you lose the connectiveness. How do you get away from there? That's a hard one. And that's by having these sessions, hopefully, that people will join. But in the end, if they don't want to join, they won't. And that's the problem.
What would you do when you see an autonomous team that's making what you think a big mistake?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm the one to judge if they're making a big mistake. If I'm really sure, because this is what usually happens when you have some more experience, right? The more experienced people who've seen things go wrong in the past will see it happening again. And then I have two choices. And I think it was Kent Beck telling me this, or someone else. They say, if I pair up with someone and I disagree with that person, and they're what we call the lower rank, like a junior in their knowledge, and you think, okay, where they're going now, it's safe to do so, right? If they make a mistake, it's safe. Let them do it. Because they learn. They can learn it by themselves, instead of me imposing and telling them, no, don't do that, because, well, then they still didn't have the experience of failing and learning from that situation for themselves. But there are situations, of course, where there's a too high risk, and then you need to sort of like, with questions, get them that insight that is not really a good idea. And we call it I'm a deep democracy facilitator, we call them kissing them over the edge, try to nudge them towards that thing. The edge, what we call, is like them getting the insight that it's not a good thing, right? I don't want to push them in, saying that's wrong, blah, blah, blah. I want to nudge them and just kiss them over the edge. That's how they explain it. So I want them to get the insight themselves, and me do as little as imposing as possible.
I think we can do two more.
Yeah.
How would you use the polarity map when working with an ivory tower architect and trying to get them to change their behavior?
Yeah, now it's a hard one. So again, going into the ranking theory, right? If they're on a higher rank, it's really hard because if they don't want to, it won't happen. That's basically the thing. So one thing you could do yourself is try to isolate yourself and game it, right? So they will make decisions. And this is happening a lot, right? They make decisions and you won't follow anyway. You do your own thing and apologize later that you didn't do it, but hey, it worked, right? That's a situation. I don't like that situation. And the other one goes into, it's in the book Software Architecture in Practice, I think, or Software Architecture Fundamentals by Mark and Neil. They say you need to have a lot of political play, right? Convincing style in negotiation and talking to them. So the best thing is usually get them inside the room and model it out yourself. I had this at some point where an architect told me, no, I'm from the outside in, imposing. And I did invite them, and I say, well, with the teams, I'm going to model it out, and you can be with us or not, that's up to you. The person was in the session, and after 2 days of doing event storming, designing it out, modeling the subdomains, he got convinced just by joining there. But I made that person part of the collaboration, right? They weren't a bystander, they were part of the collaboration, so they still could use their influence and their knowledge to be put into the model. And that's important. You want to work with them instead of, if you let a polarity work out too much, it becomes a polarization, right? Us versus them. And you always want to go towards what do we want together, to the middle ground. That's what I usually do with things like event storming.
And the last one, what do you do when different teams have different capacity to be autonomous?
Yeah. Talk with them. See, well, we use something called sense making. See, okay, how much knowledge do we have in here? Or we use something called, have anyone heard about Wortley mapping? If you're not, go to your talk, Simo, right, later. It's a great tool, but there's also a version that calls maturity mapping, where you can do it on the knowledge and skills of a team. And then you visualize it again together, seeing, oh, this person has a lot of knowledge on that certain topic, and we don't have that. Okay, what decision do we take as a team now? Should we invest in that knowledge or not? Right, so I use maturity mapping for that, to see where is the knowledge in the team, right? Is it still like only one person has it? Okay, maybe we need to invest in it. And again, that's a group decision together, how we're going to invest. Again, visualizing with a collaborative modeling tool is my key usually, yeah. Repeating myself a bit, but...
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Baas-Schwegler, happy birthday once again.
Thank you.